In the thick blackness before dawn, the great iron tongues of the abbey belfry swing to life. Their toll is not the joyful clamor of weddings, nor the triumphant call of victory. These bells are commands, sharp, unyielding. They rip children from whatever fragile dreams they manage to steal beneath thin blankets. Bare feet touch frozen stone. The shock is immediate, like stepping into the bite of winter itself. Children as young as 6 stumble from their straw pallets, their small bodies shivering violently in the drafty dormitory. Some clutch at one another's sleeves for balance, but quickly release, remembering the ever-watchful eyes of their keepers. To linger, to whisper, to comfort, any of these could bring punishment. They are herded toward the chapel, a line of shadows moving through corridors that smell of damp stone, tallow smoke, and mildew. Outside, the night still reigns. Stars pierce the cold sky, but the children cannot see them. They keep their eyes low, their minds locked on the rhythm of obedience. Left foot, right foot, keep pace, do not falter. Inside the chapel, the air is no warmer. Candles gutter weakly, casting uneven light across carved saints that seem to watch with solemn indifference. The sisters stand like statues, their voices rising in Latin chants incomprehensible to most of the little ones. The children mouth the words, fearful of forgetting the syllables. A wrong note, a hesitation, and the whip could follow. This was how countless noble daughters of the Middle Ages began their days, in darkness, in silence, in fear. The families who sent them. It is tempting from the comfort of our modern age to ask, why? Why would a parent abandon a child to such a life? The answer, as always in the Middle Ages, was tangled in duty, faith, and the ruthless arithmetic of survival. Noble families had many daughters but limited land to pass on. A girl married off would require a dowry, often a ruinous sum of silver, land, or livestock. But a girl sent to the abbey? She required only a gift to God, a one-time offering of wealth to the convent. It was cheaper, safer, and often politically advantageous. For a nobleman, placing a daughter in an abbey meant forging alliances with powerful abbesses or currying favor with bishops. For a mother, it meant one less mouth to feed during winters of scarcity. And always there was the refrain, "It is holy. It is God's will." Yet few asked the child what she thought. The shattering of innocence. Imagine being 6 years old, still clutching a rag doll, still prone to nightmares of wolves and shadows, and being led through a great wooden gate that would shut behind you forever. The abbess would greet your parents with courtesy, your dowry carefully recorded by the treasurer. Then your parents would leave. Perhaps your mother wept. Perhaps your father reminded you to be obedient and devout. But they left all the same. And there you remained, small, bewildered, and surrounded by strangers. Your hair might be shorn to mark your separation from the world. Your name might even be changed, a symbolic death of the child you once were. From that moment forward, you belonged not to your family, not even to yourself, but to God, and by extension, to the abbey. The cry of little Edith. There are fragments in chronicles, brief glimpses of the pain that filled these halls. One such entry tells of Edith, a noble child left at Barking Abbey. The moment her parents turned away, she cried out so loudly the sound echoed through the cloister, "Mother, take me with you." The chronicler, a nun herself, recorded the moment not as a tragedy but as a test of obedience. Edith's grief was considered a flaw to be corrected. The nuns responded not with comfort but with discipline. A child must learn detachment from earthly bonds, they taught, for family ties were obstacles to divine service. And so, Edith's tears were met with stern reprimands until they fell no more. Discipline in place of love. Without parental affection, children looked to one another for solace. They whispered at night, pressed hands beneath blankets, or exchanged tiny tokens. But affection was dangerous. It could be punished as idleness, vanity, even sin. A record from a 13th century convent describes the fate of a girl named Margaret, caught speaking during a forbidden hour. As punishment, she was made to kneel on bare stone while holding her arms outstretched in the shape of a cross until she collapsed from exhaustion. Her silence afterward was not born of piety but of fear. Where most children in medieval villages would have known rough affection, hugs from mothers, stories from grandmothers, games with siblings, the abbey children learned instead the chill embrace of stone, the endless echo of bells, the constant reminder that they belonged to an institution that prized obedience over love. The ritual of breaking. Day after day the cycle repeated. Wake to bells. Pray in darkness. Perform chores. Endure instruction. Sleep briefly. Wake again. This was not merely routine, it was deliberate breaking. The abbeys knew that if children were to serve faithfully as nuns, they had to be stripped of earthly attachments and childish impulses. What better way than to begin early, when the soul was still pliable, the will unformed? The silence, the hunger, the punishments, these were not accidents of neglect. They were tools sharpened and wielded with purpose. The goal was to replace the child's natural longing for family, for warmth, for play, with unquestioning devotion to God and unquestioning obedience to the abbey's hierarchy. The cost was profound. The children who walked barefoot on icy floors, who bit their lips to keep from crying, who learned to fear love as a weakness, these were children broken before they could grow. Their laughter was stolen. Their innocence was weaponized. And though the abbeys called it holiness, what echoed in the hearts of many was not divine peace but loneliness, confusion, and despair. The bells, which began every day, became symbols not of faith but of chains, audible reminders that childhood was over, and that the long gray march of duty had begun. In the medieval abbey, words were rationed more strictly than bread. Children were expected to keep their voices sealed behind their lips, speaking only when permitted, at lessons and confessions, during chants. All else was silence. It was not the soft quiet of a snowy morning or a sleeping meadow. This silence was heavy, enforced, and watched. It was silence as discipline, silence as erasure. The rule of silence. The practice came from monastic rules first written centuries earlier. Saint Benedict, whose teachings shaped countless abbeys, had declared that idle talk led to sin. The tongue was dangerous, he wrote, a serpent that spilled gossip, lies, and temptations. Better to keep it still. For children, this meant that laughter was suspect, chatter was disobedience, and even comforting a crying friend could be seen as rebellion. The abbey's corridors echoed not with play but with the shuffle of bare feet, the scrape of benches, the drone of prayers. A child's world, once filled with questions, songs, and stories, was reduced to silence. The first lessons in fear. Many records describe how silence was drilled into the very youngest. A novice at Fontevraud Abbey, barely 7 years old, whispered her fear of the dark one night. Another child, trying to be kind, whispered back a prayer of protection. Both were discovered. Their punishment, fasting on bread and water for a week, and public flogging before the other children. The abbess declared it a mercy. Better they learn early, she insisted, that the devil slips in through the mouth. Imagine it, to be so small, already trembling from hunger and cold, and then whipped not for wickedness but for the simple act of speaking your fear aloud. The lesson was clear. Your voice is dangerous. Your needs, your longings, your very words are sins in waiting. Silence is loneliness. The result was not holiness but loneliness. Children longed for connection. They missed the chatter of siblings at hearth fires, the lullabies of mothers, the stories told by old servants. In the abbey they had none of these. The silence pressed in like a shroud, day after day, night after night. A chronicle from Barking Abbey describes one little girl who began humming to herself during chores, unable to bear the weight of stillness. She was beaten and ordered to scrub floors until her hands bled. Afterward, she never made another sound. Secret codes and silent games. But children are resilient. They resist even in small ways. Archaeological finds and marginal notes in manuscripts reveal that abbey children developed secret systems of communication. A glance, a gesture, a scratch on a wooden beam, these became their language. A tap on the table might mean, "Are you afraid?" A finger traced on the sleeve could mean, "I am with you." Some even invented small games played in silence. Trading pebbles as tokens, drawing pictures in ashes, sharing scraps of cloth hidden beneath straw. These tiny rebellions were ways of saying, "I am still here. You are not alone." In such gestures, childhood fought desperately against erasure. Punishments for words. Yet when secret communication was discovered, the punishments were harsh. At St. Mary's in Winchester, records note a girl who drew a crude picture of a cat in the margin of her prayer book and passed it to a friend. The abbess, furious, declared it vanity and idolatry. The child was whipped in front of her peers and forced to copy psalms by hand for months as penance. At Barking, another girl was caught whispering her old family name. That slip of identity cost her 3 days locked in a dark cell with only bread and water. By the end, she never spoke her name again. The message was reinforced at every turn. Speech is rebellion, individuality is disobedience. Silence is indoctrination. The abbeys claimed this discipline was holy. By silencing children, they believed they cut them off from the distractions of the world and tuned them toward God. The less the tongue wagged, the more the soul could listen. But in reality, silence did not draw children closer to the divine. It severed them from one another, isolating them in fear. It broke natural bonds of friendship and solidarity, leaving only obedience. Psychologists today would recognize this as a form of control used in prisons and cults. Isolation weakens resistance. A child cut off from others is easier to mold, easier to dominate. The Abbeys may not have named it psychology, but they knew the result. And so silence remained, decade after decade, century after century. The ghost of voices lost. Think of the voices that were never heard. The laughter stifled, the questions swallowed, the songs unsung. How many poems might those children have composed if they had been allowed to play with words? How many stories might they have told, how many songs might they have sung, had silence not smothered their tongues? Instead, their voices became ghosts, haunting the margins of history. We glimpsed them only faintly, in forbidden doodles, in fragments of whispered prayers, in the few chronicles that recorded a child's slip into forbidden speech. The survival of silence. And yet, silence was not only a chain. For some, it became a shield. Children learned to survive by hiding behind it. They could endure punishments better if they did not cry out. They could avoid attention by remaining invisible, soundless. Silence became a mask that protected their fragile selves from notice, from cruelty, from despair. But masks leave marks. A child who learns that survival requires silence carries that lesson for life. Many who left abbeys as women were unable to speak easily, unable to trust their own voices. Some became nuns, perpetuating the very system that broke them, unable to imagine another way of being. Silence in the abbey was not the absence of sound. It was the crushing presence of fear. It was the learned habit of erasing oneself. For children who once ran laughing in noble halls, who once sang in meadows, this silence was not holy. It was a theft. It was the systematic unmaking of childhood itself. And all of it was done in the name of God. The abbey kitchens never produced the hearty stews or roasted meats that noble children might have known before their cloistering. Instead, food was sparse, plain, and deliberately meager. Meals were designed not to nourish but to discipline. To eat well was considered indulgence. To eat sparingly was considered holy. For the smallest children, hunger was as constant as the tolling of the bells. The theology of emptiness. In the medieval mind, the body was an enemy to the soul. To deny it food, to let it suffer, was to purify it. Abbesses preached that a rumbling stomach was a reminder of Christ's suffering, a sign that the child was walking the same path of sacrifice. Fasting, they declared, was not cruelty, it was salvation. And so children, already frail from cold and exhaustion, were routinely subjected to long fasts. Some abbeys required fasting twice a week, others demanded longer stretches during Lent and Advent. In many convents, even on days when food was given, the portions were tiny. A crust of bread, a ladle of watery pottage, sometimes a dried fish but rarely meat. The meals were eaten in silence, under the stern gaze of elders, while one sister read aloud passages of scripture reminding them that man does not live by bread alone. The body's rebellion, but the body is stubborn. Young children fainted often in the cloisters, their small forms crumpling mid-chant. The chroniclers sometimes described these incidents as signs of sanctity. Little Agnes collapsed from holy fasting, one nun proudly wrote, as if the girl's weakness were proof of divine favor. But it was not holiness, it was malnutrition. Bones grew brittle, teeth rotted, wounds healed slowly if at all. Growth was stunted. Pale skin, swollen joints, and chronic fatigue were common among abbey children. Worse still was the shame drilled into them when they felt hunger. To desire food was to desire sin. To complain of emptiness was to complain against God. Thus, even as their stomachs twisted, they learned to remain silent, equating hunger with holiness, weakness with virtue. The forbidden longings. Still, children are children. Hunger sharpened their imaginations. Some stole glances into kitchens where bread baked, filling the air with scents that tortured them. Others dreamed aloud of feasts remembered from home, tables spread with honey, roasted goose, and warm milk. Such conversations, if overheard, were punished as gluttony. Yet scraps of testimony show how strong the longing was. A marginal note in one nun's psalter, likely written when she herself was a child, simply reads, "God forgive me, I dream of cheese." Such confessions reveal how hunger was not merely physical but spiritual. Children learned to fear even their own cravings, believing their stomachs were snares set by the devil. Punishments of the table. Mealtimes were also occasions for discipline. If a child was caught eating too quickly, she might be denied food at the next meal. If she was caught sneaking crumbs, she might be forced to fast for a week on bread and water. In one recorded case at a German convent, a girl who licked honey from her fingers during a feast day was beaten until her hands bled. At times, punishments were even more symbolic. A child might be made to sit in the refectory while others ate, a bowl placed before her but left empty, a silent declaration that her appetite itself was sinful. The cult of starvation. Some abbey children, desperate to prove their devotion, turned hunger into their own weapon. They fasted beyond the rules, refusing even the meager portions allotted to them. Chroniclers praised such girls as saints in the making, their gaunt faces shining with supposed holiness. Hagiographies tell of child oblates who ate nothing but herbs, or who claimed to survive only on the Eucharist. While abbesses lauded them, these were not miracles but tragedies, starving children mistaken for saints. The line between devotion and death was perilously thin. Some did not survive it. Though the records rarely admit it outright, faint hints appear. She was taken early in great purity, or God called her young to himself. Phrases that conceal the truth. Starvation had claimed another child. Hunger's hidden rebellions. Yet hunger also bred rebellion, small acts of survival hidden in shadows. Children smuggled crumbs from the refectory, shared bites of stolen fruit, or licked grease from kitchen pots when no one was watching. Some forged quiet alliances with lay servants, begging for scraps of cheese or meat. A few manuscripts contain faint grease stains, likely marks left by hidden morsels pressed between pages. It seems some children kept food as secret treasures, as much talisman as sustenance. These tiny rebellions carried immense risk, but they also carried hope. They were ways of whispering to themselves, "My body deserves to live." The toll of hunger. The effects of hunger went beyond the physical. It eroded trust, fostered fear, and planted guilt deep in young hearts. Children learned to hate their own bodies, to see their needs as weakness. When a child's natural instinct to eat became a source of shame, the abbey's grip tightened. Hunger became another tool of control, binding the child in chains of both body and spirit. The hollow sound. Picture the great refectory after mealtime. Benches scraped back, bowls licked clean, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage. The children returned to their tasks with stomachs still hollow, the silence of the abbey broken only by the low groan of hunger rising from within them. That sound, unheard by the abbesses but remembered by the children, was the truest hymn of the convent, not praises to God, but the endless rumble of bellies never filled. Hunger, like silence, was preached as a path to holiness. But in truth it was a theft of health, of strength, of the joy of eating without shame. It was another link in the chain that bound these children, another way their innocence was drained away in the cold, stone halls of the abbey. The abbeys were not only houses of prayer, they were also engines of work. Their stone walls rang daily with the scrape of tools, the crack of wood, the grind of millstones, the splash of buckets. And into this labor were drawn the smallest hands, the children, the oblates, the novices barely strong enough to lift the tools they were given. To be holy, they were told, was to toil. And so childhood itself was drafted into endless work. The doctrine of toil. From the earliest days of monasticism, work was declared a form of worship. Saint Benedict himself had written, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." Thus, in the abbeys, every moment of a child's day was filled. When not chanting, praying, or fasting, they were laboring, scrubbing cloisters, sweeping dormitories, carrying wood, grinding grain, tending gardens, spinning wool, and scrubbing the laundry stones until their knuckles split. For the abbess, such toil served two purposes. It kept the children busy, too weary for rebellion, and it transformed drudgery into devotion, convincing them that their suffering was pleasing to God. But for the children themselves, the message was simpler. Rest is sin. Play is forbidden. The only virtue is exhaustion. Tiny bodies, heavy burdens. Records describe tasks assigned even to the youngest. At Barking Abbey, girls as young as 7 were set to carrying pails of water from the well, stumbling under the weight. At Fontevraud, they were ordered to wash the linen of the nuns, their small hands raw from lye and cold river water. Chroniclers note with pride that these little workers bore their burdens without complaint. But the reality is easier to imagine. Aching shoulders, blistered palms, children crying quietly as they dragged loads too heavy for them. And always, punishment lingered if they faltered. A spilled bucket, a torn cloth, a missed chore, any mistake could mean fasting, flogging, or extra labor piled atop the rest. The endless cleaning. Perhaps the most soul-crushing tasks were those that never ended. Floors had to be scrubbed, stone walls wiped, refectories swept, dormitories kept spotless. Dust returned each day. Mud was tracked anew. Rats gnawed the granaries. The work was never finished, and so the children were never released. One account from a German convent describes a group of oblates ordered to scrub the cloister floor with sand until their knees bled, only for the abbess to scatter ashes across the stones and command them to begin again. The task was not about cleanliness at all. It was about obedience. The kitchen fires. The kitchens, too, demanded endless labor. Children hauled wood for the fires, stirred cauldrons so large they could swallow them whole, plucked chickens, scrubbed soot-blackened pots. The air was stifling, thick with smoke and steam, yet food remained meager. The irony must have burned almost as hot as the ovens. They cooked in abundance for the abbess and honored guests, but rarely tasted more than scraps themselves. Sometimes hunger drove them to theft. A child might sneak a turnip from the pile, or lick grease from a ladle before washing it. Such thefts were discovered often, and punished severely. The kitchen fires, meant to sustain, became yet another forge of fear. Labor as erasure. The constant toil did more than exhaust their bodies. It stripped them of identity. Work replaced play, replaced learning, replaced imagination. A child who might have spent her days running fields, chasing geese, or tracing letters in sand was instead bent over buckets or kneeling on stone. In many abbeys, girls received little or no formal education beyond the memorization of prayers. They were not taught to write, to calculate, to reason. Their value lay not in their minds but in their labor. And so they became interchangeable, faceless servants in a holy machine. The silence of the workshops. Even work was not free of the abbey's obsession with silence. Children spun wool without chatter, ground grain without song, scrubbed stone without laughter. Only the sounds of toil filled the air, the creak of wheels, the scrape of brushes, the hiss of water. Imagine dozens of children bent over tasks in perfect silence, their bodies moving in rhythm like parts of a machine. Not workers with voices, but shadows with hands. The abbess called it discipline. But in truth it was the erasure of joy. The hidden injuries. Labor left scars, both seen and unseen. Manuscripts mention lameness, weak eyes, and twisted hands among nuns who had grown up in the abbey. These were not miracles of suffering. They were the inevitable result of overworked bodies. Bad joints from carrying loads too heavy, blindness from long hours spinning by candlelight, permanent stoops from scrubbing stone floors. And yet, such injuries were not pitied. They were praised as signs of holy endurance. A crooked spine was not seen as abuse but as evidence of devotion. Small defiances. Still, as with silence and hunger, children found ways to resist. Some worked slowly on purpose, forcing supervisors to scold them, but keeping their bodies from breaking too quickly. Others hid tools, delayed tasks, or whispered jokes when no one was listening. A few stole scraps of time, sitting in shadowed corners for a stolen breath of rest. Such moments were tiny, fleeting, but they mattered. They reminded the children that they were not simply cogs in a machine, but human beings still capable of choice, even if the choice was only to pause. The night's ache. At the end of long days, the children returned to the dormitories, too tired even to whisper. Their bodies ached, their hands stung, their clothes were damp with sweat and river water. They lay on straw pallets and stared at the rafters, the silence broken only by groans as they shifted sore limbs. For some, sleep came quickly from sheer exhaustion. For others, hunger and pain kept them awake. What dreams they had we cannot know. But perhaps in those dreams they ran again in open fields, their hands not raw from scrubbing, their feet not blistered from carrying, their bellies not empty. Labor in the abbey was called holy. But for the children, it was simply another form of theft. Stealing time, stealing energy, stealing the very years meant for laughter and growth. By the time they were grown, most had forgotten what it meant to live without constant toil. The abbey had forged them into shadows of themselves, obedient, weary, and broken. Medieval abbeys cloaked discipline in holy language, calling punishment a medicine for the soul. But the children who endured it knew better. They knew the sting of the rod, the lash of leather, the sharp crack of wood against skin. They learned that obedience was not simply requested, it was beaten into them. Discipline as salvation. Abbesses justified violence with scripture. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," they quoted, insisting that pain trained the young heart for heaven. Chroniclers praised discipline as proof of love. To whip a child was to save her from sin. To beat disobedience from her body was to purify her spirit. Thus, punishment was not hidden in shadows. It was public, deliberate, ritualized. And children lived in constant fear of it. The instruments of pain. The abbey kept its arsenal simple: rods of hazel or willow, leather straps, wooden paddles. The rod was favored, flexible, sharp, easy to wield. Strikes landed across backs, hands, or bare thighs. In some convents, the child was stripped, humiliation mingling with pain. Whippings varied in length, sometimes a few sharp blows, sometimes dozens. Records describe children corrected until they bled, then forced to kneel in silence afterward, their sobs muffled by stone walls. Punishment left not only bruises but scars. Thin white lines across arms and legs, reminders etched into flesh. The theater of fear. Most punishments were carried out in front of others. When one child broke silence or stole food, the abbess summoned the entire dormitory. The guilty was dragged to the center, beaten while the others watched. This was theater, not correction. The abbess was teaching every child the same lesson. Disobedience would be answered with pain. Witnessing another's punishment was its own torment. Children sat frozen, stomachs churning, listening to the thud of the rod, the stifled cries of their friend. Some fainted from fear. Others wept in secret after, ashamed that they had not intervened. But intervention was impossible. The abbey allowed no rescue, no rebellion. Only silence. Invented crimes. Not all punishments required real offenses. Sometimes, abbesses used the rod to enforce impossible rules. A child who sneezed during prayer might be beaten. A novice who stumbled on a chant was whipped. At times, abbesses punished without reason at all, striking children simply to remind them of authority. This arbitrariness was deliberate. It taught the children that safety did not exist, that punishment could come at any time for any reason. Fear became constant, unavoidable, woven into every breath. The punishments of shame. Pain was not the only weapon. Shame was wielded with equal cruelty. Children were made to kneel for hours on stone floors, arms outstretched in the shape of the cross until their muscles trembled. Some were forced to wear signs around their necks declaring their sin, idle, greedy, disobedient. Others endured the cold cell, locked alone in darkness for days with only bread and water. The silence was crushing, the isolation unbearable. For young children especially, this punishment was as scarring as the whip. The paradox of love and fear. Perhaps the deepest cruelty was the abbess's insistence that such punishments were acts of love. Children were told to thank their punishers. After whippings, some were made to kiss the rod as if acknowledging its sanctity. They were told that each blow erased sin, that the pain was God's mercy, not man's cruelty. And so, confusion festered. Love was pain. Care was cruelty. Holiness was suffering. The abbey blurred every boundary until children no longer knew the difference between devotion and abuse. The unspoken wounds. What of the wounds left behind? Some children limped for weeks after punishment. Some bore scars for life. But deeper still were the wounds of the mind, the nightmares, the flinches at sudden movement, the terror of authority figures. Modern eyes might call it trauma. But in the abbey it was called discipline. No one asked if the children were broken. They asked only if the children were obedient. Moments of resistance. And yet, even here, resistance flickered. Children whispered to one another in the dark, comforting the punished with stolen words of kindness. Some smuggled herbs from gardens to soothe bruises. Others hid broken rods in wells or fires, small acts of defiance that denied the abbess her tools of pain. Rarely, a child might even take punishment in silence, not from obedience but from quiet rebellion. Refusing to cry was a way to deny the abbess her satisfaction. It was the only power left, to suffer without breaking. The echoes of the whip. Picture the sound that haunted those stone halls. Not chant, not prayer, but the sharp crack of wood against flesh. A sound followed by silence too heavy, too afraid to breathe. That echo lived inside the children, long after the bruises faded. Long after they grew into nuns themselves. Long after the abbesses who struck them were gone. It was a sound that never left them. A sound of childhood stolen, faith twisted, innocence beaten into submission. Discipline in the abbey was praised as holy correction. But in truth, it was violence cloaked in piety. It was one more chain, binding children in a cycle of fear and obedience. One more theft of their youth, their freedom, their joy. The whip did not sanctify them. It scarred them. The abbey's walls were not merely stone. They were psychological fortresses, closing in on the minds of the children within. Through silence, hunger, labor, and punishment, the abbesses sought to carve the inner world of each child into a mirror of obedience. Thought itself was subject to discipline. Imagination was branded as danger. Doubt was condemned as sin. What emerged was not simply a devout novice, but a mind cloistered as tightly as the body. The war on memory. For many oblates, the first memories of childhood were swiftly buried. Some were given to the abbey so young that their family faces blurred with time. Others clung to fragments. A mother's lullaby, the smell of bread in a hearth, the warmth of siblings' laughter. But such memories were discouraged. Abbesses told the children to forget their homes, their names, their past lives. The world is temptation, they said. Forget it and you will be free. And so, memory itself became dangerous. A child who whispered of her family risked rebuke or punishment. Better to stay silent, to bury longing so deeply that it no longer stirred. Over years, the past faded into shadows, replaced by chants and chores. Childhood before the Abbey came to seem like a dream. The policing of thought. It was not enough to regulate action. Thought had to be controlled as well. Children were told that God saw every thought. A flicker of anger at an abbess, a moment of envy, a wish for escape, any of these could condemn them. The devil lives in your mind, they were warned, so they learned to distrust themselves. Every feeling was suspect. Every private thought a possible sin. Even in the silence of their own heads, they felt watched. In this way, the Abbey colonized not only their bodies but their very consciousness. Dreams as betrayals. Even sleep was not free. Children sometimes confessed dreams to their confessors, fearing they revealed sinful desires. A dream of family was called attachment. A dream of play was idleness. A dream of food was gluttony. One chronicler tells of a novice who dreamed she was dancing in a meadow. When she told her abbess, she was flogged for harboring worldly joy. What did this teach the children? That even their unconscious selves betrayed them. That there was no safe refuge, not even in dreams. The theft of language. Language too was reshaped. The enforced silence stripped children of casual speech, but more than that, it rewired how they used words. Playful talk, storytelling, even jokes became unthinkable. Speech became a narrow channel, confined to chants, prayers, confessions, and the answering of orders. Soon many no longer knew how to speak freely at all. When confronted with outsiders, some stammered, unable to form sentences beyond rehearsed liturgy. Others were said to have forgotten the rhythms of ordinary speech, their words flat and halting. The Abbey had taken their voices, not only in sound but in thought. Fear as compass. With punishment unpredictable, fear became the guiding force in decision-making. A child did not ask, "What do I want?" She asked, "What will keep me safe from pain?" That question narrowed her world to a single point, the will of authority. Desire was replaced with avoidance. Imagination was replaced with caution. In time, fear became indistinguishable from conscience. The voice of terror was mistaken for the voice of God. The collapse of self. Perhaps the most profound effect was the erosion of selfhood. A child entered the Abbey with a name, a family, a personality. Over years, these were chipped away. She became simply the oblate, the novice, the servant. Uniform clothing erased individuality. Identical routines erased preference. Punishments erased defiance. Silence erased opinion. What was left was a hollowed-out self, defined only by obedience. Some scholars call this the monastic self, a person remade into a vessel of devotion. But to the children, it may have felt like disappearance, the fractured mind. Yet not all minds yielded so easily. For some, the constant pressure fractured thought into compartments. Outwardly obedient, they kept secret inner worlds alive, tiny mental refuges of memory, imagination, or rebellion. One might silently recite childhood songs during chores. Another might imagine stories while spinning wool. Another might rehearse conversations with her long-lost family. These inner sanctuaries were fragile but essential. They preserved fragments of individuality beneath the crushing weight of conformity. But they also came at a cost. The constant fear of discovery, the guilt of harboring forbidden thoughts. To keep a secret mind was itself an act of defiance. The logic of survival. And yet, amid the distortions, children developed strategies of survival. They learned to read the smallest gestures of abbesses. The twitch of a hand, the shift of a brow, predicting moods before punishment fell. They mastered silence, shaping faces into masks that revealed nothing. They became experts at hiding hunger, hiding anger, hiding thought. This survival demanded intelligence, even cunning. But it was intelligence turned inward, used not to grow or explore but simply to endure. Faith twisted by fear. Perhaps the most tragic theft was the twisting of faith. Children entered the Abbey with trust. Trust that God was love, that prayer brought comfort, that devotion was joy. But after years of fear, punishment, and deprivation, faith itself was reshaped into something darker. God became the all-seeing warden. Prayer became a desperate plea for mercy. Holiness became indistinguishable from suffering. For some, belief collapsed entirely, leaving only emptiness. For others, it survived, but forever entangled with fear. The invisible prison. In the end, the greatest prison was not stone but thought. Even when children grew into women with power of their own, many carried the abbey inside them. They still feared disobedience, still distrusted desire, still silenced their own thoughts. Some abbesses, themselves once oblates, perpetuated the same disciplines they had endured, not because they were cruel, but because the cloistered mind could not imagine another way. The cycle continued, not by force alone, but by the invisible chains wrapped around thought itself. The abbey did not simply confine bodies. It reshaped minds, teaching children to police themselves long after the whip was put away. The silence, hunger, labor, and punishment lived on inside them, echoes that blurred memory, eroded selfhood, and cloistered thought into obedience. In this way, the abbey's power endured far beyond its walls. What happens when a childhood is spent in silence, hunger, toil, and fear? The abbey did not release its hold once the children grew. Whether they remained within the convent walls or left for the outside world, the lessons of discipline, obedience, and fear stayed with them. The child became the novice became the nun, and the nun often became the abbess who shaped the next generation. The abbey was not just a place, it was a cycle. Those who stayed. For many there was no choice but to remain. Once bound as oblates, they belonged to the abbey. Marriage, family, freedom, all had been erased long ago. Even if they dreamed of leaving, where would they go? Their families were strangers now. The world was distant, frightening, unknown. So they stayed. They took vows. They shed the last remnants of childhood identity. They became part of the order that had raised them. But the child inside them, the one who once longed for freedom, did not disappear. She lingered, silent, buried beneath chants and rituals. The cycle of discipline. Some of these women rose to power, becoming prioresses or abbesses themselves. Here lies the darkest truth. Many who once suffered became the enforcers of suffering. Not always out of cruelty, though some embraced it, but often because they could not imagine another way. To them, harsh discipline was love. Hunger was holiness. Silence was safety. They had been shaped in this mold, and they shaped others the same. And so, the cycle endured. Each generation of oblates carried the scars of the last. The habit of silence. Those who stayed learned silence so deeply that it became second nature. Even when rules no longer forbade speech, many found themselves unable to talk freely. Words stuck in their throats, tangled in fear of saying the wrong thing. Some spoke in whispers even in private. Others confessed that they did not know how to make conversation at all. Silence was no longer a rule. It was a habit of the soul. The body remembered. The body too carried memories. Bruises faded, but flinches remained. A hand raised too quickly could make an adult nun shrink back. A harsh word could send her heart racing. Hunger, endured for years, left its own legacy. Some nuns could never eat without guilt, always fearing that too much food was sin. Others hoarded scraps in secret, unable to trust that tomorrow's meal would come. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. Faith entangled with fear. Perhaps the deepest shadow was spiritual. Even as adults, many nuns could not separate God from punishment. They prayed not out of love but out of fear. They confessed sins they had not committed, terrified that a stray thought might damn them. For some, faith became a cage. For others, it collapsed entirely, leaving them hollow. Yet few spoke of this crisis. To question was to betray the very life they had been forced to embrace. Silence swallowed even doubt. The outside world. Not all oblates stayed behind abbey walls. Some, through unusual circumstances, were released back into the world. But freedom did not always heal. A girl raised in silence did not suddenly learn to speak. A woman taught to fear every desire did not suddenly embrace choice. They carried the cloister with them like an invisible shroud. Some returned to families only to find themselves strangers. Their kin had changed, they themselves were unrecognizable. Conversations faltered. Bonds with siblings were lost. They were outsiders in their own homes. Others sought new lives, marriage, work, survival, but the abbey lingered. They woke in the night hearing phantom chants. They recoiled from laughter, unable to share in joy. They lived as if the walls still surrounded them, though none were there. The weight of silence across generations. The silence of the abbey spread beyond its own walls. Some who left bore children of their own. And though they tried to raise them differently, the habits of fear and silence seeped through. A hand lifted in anger. A word of discipline said too sharply. A distrust of laughter or play. Generational echoes whispered on, long after the abbey itself had crumbled. The secret bonds. Yet there were also survivors who carried something else. Quiet bonds with those who had shared their childhood. Nuns who had grown up together in hardship often shared an unspoken understanding. They knew each other's scars. They comforted each other in subtle ways: a glance across the choir stalls, a small kindness at mealtime, a whispered word of reassurance when punishment loomed. For some, these bonds were the only warmth they ever knew. Whispers of resistance. Even in adulthood, resistance sometimes stirred. Some abbesses, themselves shaped by cruelty, broke the cycle. They eased punishments, allowed speech, fed children more generously. Their reforms were small, fragile, often resisted by others, but they mattered. They proved that not all who endured passed on the same pain. Some chose another path even when it was hard. These women were rare, but their whispers of kindness echoed as powerfully as the lash. The inescapable past. But for most, the Abbey was inescapable. It shaped not only their childhoods but their whole lives. It followed them into adulthood, into leadership, into death. Even in their final prayers, the echoes of silence, hunger, and fear lingered. The shadows of childhood stretched long. The cycle endures. The most haunting truth is this: the Abbey's cruelty was not a failure of its system. It was its success. It created generations who obeyed, who feared, who carried silence within them. It reproduced itself through the very children it broke. And thus the cycle endured, through stone walls, through voices silenced, through minds reshaped, through shadows carried into adulthood. The Abbey was never only about walls of stone. It was about walls inside the soul, walls that followed children long after their childhoods ended. Even when grown, they remained cloistered. Even in freedom, they remained bound. For centuries, the voices of Abbey children were lost. Their cries did not echo in chronicles. Their fears were not written in the margins of manuscripts. The Abbey spoke with the voice of its abbesses, its rules, its chants. The children remained voiceless. But silence is never perfect. Whispers survive. Traces linger. And in time, silence can be broken. The historian's task. In archives, historians began to notice the gaps. Where were the records of childhood? Where were the stories of oblates, of novices, of children raised in cloisters? Official documents spoke of discipline, devotion, obedience. But occasionally, a marginal note, a complaint, or a stray account hinted at something darker. A scribbled line about a novice fainting from hunger. A letter from a visiting bishop shocked by harsh punishments. A confession from an adult nun recalling her fear as a child. Piece by piece, the fragments accumulated. What was once invisible began to take shape. The hidden history of childhood in the Abbey. The unearthed stories. In some places, burial grounds revealed the truth more starkly. Archaeologists unearthed the graves of children. Small bones laid among the sisters, sometimes with signs of malnutrition or disease worsened by deprivation. These graves bore silent testimony. Children had lived here, suffered here, and often died here. Other traces emerged in the oral traditions of nearby towns. Villagers sometimes told tales of children who had disappeared into the stone. Legends of lost voices, ghostly chants at night, or silent processions of young faces haunted local lore. Once dismissed as superstition, these stories began to be re-examined with new weight. Survivors who spoke. Most powerful of all were the rare accounts of survivors. Some women who had left the Abbey in unusual circumstances lived long enough to tell their stories. In old age, free from vows, they whispered what had once been unspeakable. They spoke of hunger that gnawed through childhood, of silence that strangled speech, of punishments that bruised not just the body but the soul. For many, speaking was painful. Words cracked open scars long buried, but it was also liberating. At last, the child within them could be heard. The weight of secrecy. Why had it taken so long? Because silence was not just imposed in childhood. It followed into adulthood. To criticize the Abbey was to criticize God, faith, the very system that defined one's life. Few dared. And so, secrecy endured. Generations passed without acknowledgement. Pain remained unspoken, carried like a private burden. Breaking that silence required more than courage. It required a cultural shift. A willingness at last to listen to the voices of children long gone. The modern reckoning. In recent decades, this reckoning has grown sharper. Societies around the world have begun to confront the hidden abuses of institutions. Churches, schools, orphanages. Testimonies from survivors of convents and monasteries are part of this larger awakening. Communities have demanded answers. What happened to these children? How many suffered? How many died in silence? The questions cannot always be fully answered. Records are missing. Graves are unmarked. Memories have faded. But the act of asking itself breaks the silence. The role of descendants. Descendants too have sought the truth. Families who once gave children to the abbey have begun to ask, what became of them? Some uncover only fragments, a baptismal record here, a burial there. Others find nothing but absence. Yet even absence speaks. It reveals the way childhoods were erased, voices lost, names forgotten. For descendants, this search is both grief and restoration. To recover even a whisper of a child's story is to give them back their humanity. The transformation of memory. As these stories resurface, the way we view the abbey itself changes. No longer is it only a place of serene devotion, stone cloisters, and holy chants. It is also a place where children wept in silence, where fear was carved into memory, where laughter was forbidden. This dual memory does not erase the devotion of those who found meaning in the cloister, but it complicates it. It forces us to see the abbey in full, not just as a monument of faith, but as a site of hidden suffering, commemoration and healing. In some places, communities have begun to commemorate the lost children. Plaques are placed on abbey walls, acknowledging the oblates who lived and died there. Memorials are erected in burial grounds, giving names to those who were forgotten. Services are held not only for the saints and abbesses, but for the voiceless novices who never reached adulthood. These acts do not undo the past, but they honor the children who once had no voice. They declare that silence has been broken, the survivor's voice in the present. Perhaps the most moving development is the survivor's voice heard in the present. Elderly women, once oblates, sometimes speak publicly now. They share memories long suppressed. They describe the cold, the hunger, the punishments, but also the small moments of defiance and solidarity that kept them alive. Their voices tremble, but they do not fall silent. In their words, the abbey's children live again, not as shadows but as people. Why their voices matter? Why does this matter so long after the stones have crumbled? Because the story of abbey childhoods is not only history, it is a warning. It reveals how power can exploit vulnerability, how silence can erase suffering, how institutions can hide cruelty beneath the veil of holiness. It reminds us that children, whether in abbeys centuries ago or institutions today, are always the most vulnerable. Their voices are the easiest to silence and the most necessary to hear. By listening now, we honor those who were unheard. We ensure that their shadows do not vanish into history once more. Breaking the cycle. The silence has lasted centuries. But with every testimony, every grave uncovered, every name remembered, the cycle breaks a little more. The abbey's power was in silence. Its undoing is in speech. Children who once wept without sound are finally given voice. The silence has been broken. The abbey's shadows are no longer hidden. And though nothing can undo the suffering, the act of telling, at last, brings dignity to those who endured. Stone crumbles. Walls fall. Chants fade into air. But the memories of childhood, the cries, the silence, the hunger, the fleeting whispers of laughter, do not vanish. They echo through time, carried in bones, in stories, in scars, in the words finally spoken centuries later. The abbey is no longer what it was. Some stand as ruins, ivy climbing over cracked cloisters. Others survive as museums, tourist sites, or quiet retreats. But none are as they once were, places where children lived out whole childhoods under the shadow of vows they never chose. Yet though the buildings have changed, the echo of those cloistered childhoods remains. The fragile lives of children. We began with the oblate, the child given to the abbey. A girl or boy led through gates of stone, leaving behind family and freedom, stepping into a world of silence and discipline. A childhood reshaped into obedience. These were fragile lives. Some adapted, some resisted, some broke. Some died before adulthood. All were marked forever. To see childhood in the abbey is to confront fragility, not only of children but of humanity's tendency to silence them. The cycle of silence. We traced how silence defined their days. Silence in prayer. Silence in meals. Silence in play where play itself was forbidden. Silence in punishment where crying was a sin. This silence was not only absence of sound. It was a structure, a cage, a method of control. It trained children to suppress voice, desire, even thought. And when children became adults, that silence did not vanish. It followed them, shaping their speech, their faith, their very sense of self. It spread through generations, lingering even when the abbey walls were gone. Silence was the abbey's most enduring legacy, the resilience of the human spirit. And yet, we saw also the small resistances. A whispered word in the dormitory at night. A crumb of bread shared between friends. A smile exchanged across the choir stalls. These were fragile acts, but they mattered. They proved that even in silence, the human spirit sought connection. Even in control, children found ways to be children. The Abbey shaped them but never completely erased them. Some ember of self endured. The survivor's burden. For those who lived into adulthood, the burden was heavy. Some became part of the system, enforcing on others what had once been inflicted on them. Others carried their scars quietly, their struggles invisible to the world outside. A few broke the silence and spoke, leaving precious testimonies. All carried the Abbey within them. The cloister was not only a building but a memory etched into mind and body. This is the cruelest legacy. The Abbey's power did not end at its walls. It lived on in those it shaped, the rediscovery of their voices. And yet today we can hear them. Historians, archaeologists, survivors, and descendants have pieced together the fragments. They have given voice to the voiceless. They have shown us that behind the serene image of the Abbey was a harsher reality, one where children bore the weight of a system too large for them. In this rediscovery, silence is undone. The children once forgotten are remembered. The nameless become named. The lost are acknowledged. This act of remembrance is not only about the past. It is about the present. It demands that we hear children today, that we refuse to let silence erase them again. The moral of the cloister. So what do these cloistered childhoods teach us? They teach us that institutions, however holy, however revered, can fail the most vulnerable. They teach us that silence, when imposed, is not peace but oppression. They teach us that children's voices matter, and that to ignore them is to repeat history's cruelties. The Abbey was not unique. Across history, in orphanages, schools, workhouses, and other institutions, children have been silenced, disciplined, erased. The cloister is one chapter in a larger story of vulnerability and power. To confront it is to confront that larger truth, the light in the shadows. And yet, even here we find not only darkness. In the midst of silence, there were friendships. In the midst of fear, there were small acts of care. In the midst of suffering, there was survival. These children were not only victims. They were survivors, bearers of resilience. Their lives, though shaped by suffering, also reveal the strength of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and sometimes resist. To remember them is not only to mourn but to honor. The modern responsibility. Today, as we walk through Abbey ruins or visit preserved cloisters, we often marvel at the beauty, the arches, the stained glass, the quiet peace. But beauty should not blind us. We must also listen for the echoes, the unheard cries, the silenced laughter. Our responsibility is twofold: to honor those who endured, to ensure that no child today suffers in similar silence. The past is a warning. If we ignore it, the cycle can return. The final echo. In the end, the story of the Abbey's children is not simply about religion or history or architecture. It is about humanity. It asks us, what do we owe to children? Do we see them as voices to be heard, or as clay to be molded? Do we grant them freedom, or do we silence them for the sake of order? The Abbey chose silence. It shaped generations through fear and obedience. But in doing so, it left behind a shadow that has taken centuries to unveil. Now, as we remember, we choose differently. We choose to listen. Closing reflection. The Abbey's stones may crumble, but the memory remains. The silence may have lasted centuries, but it is broken now. The children of the cloister, once voiceless, now speak through history. Their whispers reach us across time, fragile but insistent. We were here. We mattered. We must be remembered. And in that act of remembering, their shadows become light. Epilogue: A walk among ruins. Imagine walking today through the ruins of an old abbey. Grass grows where once children knelt in prayer. Birds sing where silence was once enforced. The air carries freedom where once it carried fear. And yet, if you pause, you may feel it, the echo. The echo of small feet pacing stone floors. The echo of whispers quickly silenced. The echo of hunger unspoken. The echo of a childhood lived in shadows. These echoes are not ghosts. They are memories. They are warnings. They are voices finally heard. The Abbey is quiet now, but its silence is no longer unbroken. We hear the children. We honor them. And we carry their lesson forward. Never again should silence be forced upon those who most need to speak.